Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now I recently paired an RTX 5070 Ti with an i7-12700F and found that when gaming at 2160p the GPU was being fully utilised almost all of the time. Sure, a newer more powerful CPU may improve frame rates and frame times in some games, especially at lower resolutions where we'll be more CPU limited, but at 4K this pairing is pretty good. That got me thinking, what if we pair this powerful gaming card with a second-hand PC that I picked up for £113, about $142. Inside this thing is an Intel Xeon CPU with 12 cores and 24 threads, as well as 16GB of 2133MHz DDR4 and an 850W PSU that didn't actually come with any PCIe cables. A couple of essential tweaks later then and we were good to go. Now this isn't a realistic example of a system you should build, but I thought it would be interesting to see how much performance we lose at 2160p where our 5070 Ti is working at its hardest. I'll have the Xeon gameplay on screen with the comparative stats visible too. So we'll start off with Cyberpunk 2077 here with the high settings, of course at 4K, which we'll remain with throughout. Now with the Xeon I was surprised to see 60 frames per second, and actually in a lot of areas the GPU was being fully utilised. That said, when we moved into more crowded zones downtown Night City, this is where we started to see a few more inconsistencies, a few more dips and drops. Now our average at 60 FPS was pretty solid, but our 1 and 0.1% lows of 36 and 31 basically represent what I was just talking about. Now when we compare these results to that of an i7-12700F, whereby the card will pretty much be maxed out most of the time, we're losing about 12 FPS. Not just that, but it's with the percentile lows as well that we can notice a significant difference. As I was saying before, a newer or more powerful CPU will give you more consistent gameplay, which is equally as important as an average frame rate, sometimes more important, because it doesn't matter if you're getting 60 frames per second or above if the gameplay is jumping all over the place. Still, 60 frames per second is nothing to complain about, and as we move on to Black Myth Wukong, this difference is even smaller. Now with the Xeon here and the medium preset, again of course at 2160p, I'll stop saying that because it's obvious what the resolution is throughout this video. We got 61 FPS with a 1% low of 50 and a 0.1% low of 34, so this is certainly a lot more consistent, and when we take into consideration the comparative results from the 12700F, it wasn't actually all that different. We saw about 6 or 7 frames per second more on average with the newer chip, and the same can be said for the 1 and 0.1% lows as well. We're not actually losing that much performance. Considering I paid for this second-hand Xeon build what I paid for the i7, about the same money. In fact, I paid less for the Xeon system as a whole than I did for the i7. I think I paid about 150 for that on eBay. Yeah, I don't think it's too bad. Again, not a realistic pairing, but interesting to see that in this more GPU limited title, our performance will be closer to that of the game running on a newer configuration. And that's really what it comes down to, whether or not a game is more GPU or CPU intensive. If it's a CPU intensive title particularly, then you are going to notice, like in Cyberpunk, a bigger difference with the results. As we move on to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, it's a similar story. Here I was running with the high preset and the default AA SMAA 2TX. We saw 74 frames per second here, just running around town causing absolute chaos with the residents. 74 FPS overall, the 1% low of 59 and a 0.1% low of 46. So again, it's a pretty consistent gameplay session here. Now when we compare the results to the i7, we got 79, 1% low of 71 and a 0.1% low of 67. So as expected, again, the newer system did provide a better frame rate overall, as well as consistent frame times. And it's worth noting that the i7 machine uses 32GB of RAM, DDR5 that is, at 6400 MHz. So it's a more powerful system all round, of course, uses all modern components, things like that. And even so, the difference isn't that huge. Of course, the difference will be even bigger if we were using a 5080 or 5090, two cards that I don't have. But it's interesting to note that in some cases the Xeon is holding up pretty well. Nothing that's made me think, oh, this is awful so far anyway. But let's move on to Spider-Man 2 and see if that opinion still stands. So here we are with the high preset then, using DLAA. With the Xeon we saw 63 frames per second. Now this is a bit of a mess even at the best of times. Our average was pretty good. Our 1% low was 41 and our 0.1% low was 36. So initially when playing I thought, this isn't all that great. But when we look at the comparative i7 results, our average was quite a bit better, noticeably better in fact, but our percentile numbers didn't really change. It wasn't actually that smoother when using the newer processor at this resolution. Of course the average is high, but as I was saying before, the percentile lows are equally as important, and we still experienced dips and drops in and around the city here, where of course you'll spend most of your time in game. I'd say it's playable on both, but considering the price difference between these two setups, it's not a bad result at all for the Xeon E5. This is the V4 version of the chip, the 2687W. Each version has different core counts and thread counts, things like that, so just be aware of which one you are buying. Always look up the exact model number if you found one on eBay. And it's always worth buying an older Xeon pre-built, I think, these days than trying to configure something from scratch, because you're probably going to find better deals on an entire system. That's partly why I like buying these older systems as well, because you can get them cheap, 100 quid or whatever, and the components inside, more often than not, will actually be worth more than that when sold individually. It can be a great way to make a bit of money on a few older machines. Starfield was a bit of a mess. This is certainly more CPU intensive, and I can definitely tell here 53 frames per second with a 1% low of 33 and a 0.1% low of 17 in and around a kilo. When we compare that to the i7, well, this game definitely prefers the newer CPU and architecture. We saw a very nice 69 FPS with a 1% low of 57 and a 0.1% low of 37. So it's basically better all round in this case. I was expecting this from Starfield going into it, to be honest, because it is a very CPU intensive game in busier areas where there's a lot going on, a lot of NPCs on screen, and it just doesn't agree with this older CPU architecture all that much. Still looks good though. It's certainly playable to a degree, but this highlights the differences that you can expect when using a more modern processor. The Witcher 3, I thought I'd try ray tracing this time around, so I went with the RT Ultra preset. We actually needed DLSS quality enabled to hit 60 plus FPS with the i7. That said, we weren't so lucky with the Xeon, which came back with an average of 45. The percentile lows weren't too bad, 32 and 28, so it wasn't too inconsistent. It was just quite a bit noticeably worse than it was with the modern configuration, which of course is to be expected most of the time, or so I thought, but as shown there are some instances where the differences won't be all that huge, and there are some where it will be, so that's worth bearing in mind. Baldur's Gate 3 was another example of a game that didn't really agree with the old Xeon 12 core. 64 frames per second sounds good on paper, but the 1 and 0.1% lows of 31 and 19 certainly let it down a bit, especially when we compare it to the i7 results, where we saw 108 frames per second, a 1% low of 73 and a 0.1% low of 46. So even our 1% low figure, as seen in the previous result as well, actually is better than that of the average with the older Xeon chip. We'll finalise then with Red Dead Redemption 2. Now this is another more positive result. With the ultra textures, everything else set to high, and TAA also set to high. We saw 91 frames per second on average in and around Valentine, a 1% low of 54 and a 0.1% low of 32. I did notice a little stutter every so often, like a micro stutter. This wasn't actually present with the i7, and of course this did impact our percentile lows, which came in at 54 and 32, whereas on the i7 they were 1873, so as expected, a lot more consistent. But I don't think the Xeon did too bad here, especially in pairing with 16 gigs of 2133 MHz DDR4, and I think there are certainly things we could do to improve the performance of the Xeon machine a little bit, but we could add more RAM, certainly. We could perhaps overclock the CPU, but ultimately the CPU itself is certainly going to be a limitation. There's only so much we can do, and I think in the results that weren't too good, they're still not going to be all that improved in the more processor intensive titles, but that's to be expected. An older CPU, an older architecture, in some cases it did pretty well in keeping up with the newer chip, and I think this has made for a pretty interesting set of results, and hopefully you feel the same way. But thank you very much for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.